The Mill Creek Flood. Let's take a look at this devastating event, tonight, on Project Algerine. Woefully inadequate, could only describe the flood planning for Mill Creek, a 19-mile tributary which empties into Lake Erie, and runs directly through the city. The floodplain is already saturated, from a series of storms that struck the area over the previous few days. But now, the perfect storm is brewing. A vigorous tropical system was moving up the east coast, which interacted with a low-pressure system over the Great Lakes. As a result, the area saw a once-in-a-650-year storm. Over 250 homes, 300 businesses and structures, and 40 lives are about to be lost. This is the Mill Creek Flood. August 3, 1915. We're at a small stone bridge on 26th Street, between French and State. In the afternoon the clouds begin to thicken up. By 3:30 p.m. it begins raining and continues till 5 a.m. the next day. The torrent of water upstream begins pushing a massive amount of logs and mud against the tiny bridge, in essence creating a dam. The water quickly begins to back up, and creates a large pool, in the area where Veterans Stadium is located today. Police and firefighters respond, as the water continues to rise. The water was now backed up for several blocks, and showed no signs of letting up. A fireman attempted to clear the debris from the culvert, using dynamite, but the effort failed. Word was finally relayed to evacuate the homes and businesses below, but by that time, it was too late. Residents that had gathered nearby couldn't do much but watch the horror unfold before them. At 8:45 p.m., the water crested and broke through the dam, sending a 2-block wall of water, 20 feet high, traveling 25 miles per hour through the city. The bridge at 24th Street was completely obliterated by the force of the water, along with the compounding debris from upstream, that seemed to multiply as each block passed. Just below the bridge on 24th Street, between French and State, Erie Fire Chief John McMahon and 25-year-old firefighter, John Donovan are in the midst of rescuing a group of women from a home. Witnesses say that Donovan pulled a mother and her baby from the torrent of water, and immediately jumped back in, to rescue others. Both men were on the roof of a collapsed house. They just rescued a blind woman from her home when a rush of water lifted the house. One after another, the houses were ripped right from their foundations. Chief McMahon and Donovan clung to the roof of the home for several blocks. Just before smashing into the carriage works, Donovan attempts to push Chief McMahon off the roof to a shallow area. The houses crumpled into the building with great force. Bigger pieces of debris begin to overcome Donovan. Eventually he is struck in the head by a large object, and goes under. Chief McMahon is nowhere to be found. The flood is now several blocks wide and growing. By the time the flood reached the Nickel Plate Railroad, just south of 18th Street, the height of the water was reportedly 15 feet. People came to help search for survivors. A woman heard groans from under a pile of debris on the northern side of the Nickel Plate Railroad bridge, under which contained the missing fire chief. McMahon was stuck under a large pile of debris, along with being embedded in a few feet of mud and muck. It took several men to retrieve him from the area. McMahon is in bad shape. He has several broken ribs from being crushed by debris, and has nearly drowned. He credits the young Donovan with saving his life. After several hours, Donovan's body is discovered nearby. His feet were sticking out from under a pile of rubble. Underneath the pile, he was found still clutching a tree limb. Records show, Donovan saved a lot of people that night. Unfortunately, he couldn't save the people downstream for what was coming next. Erie police officer Harry Grant arrives at 18th and State Street. He is immediately summoned to help with rescue efforts currently underway on 19th and French. Officer Grant, along with a City of Erie electrician, made their way to the area with a large rope. But getting over there wasn't easy, and they crossed the raging torrent of water by crawling across the shaky remains of the nickel plate railroad bridge. Once on the other side, they were able to rescue several people from their homes before the floodwaters carried them away. Just down from here was what could only be described as a horrific sight. On the northeast corner of 18th and French, a trolley has smashed into a storefront. The trolley car was pushed 8 blocks before coming to rest here. A woman's body was discovered here pinned between the trolley wreckage and the building. She had been crushed almost beyond recognition. Moving downstream to 17th and French, people were still running for cover. Almost all the homes were destroyed in this area. Just a block away, on State Street, a shopkeeper said the water was as high as his cash register. He had to escape his store by crawling out the window. Records indicate there was heavy damage to the stores along this area. Some of the shop's basements became filled entirely with mud. The railroad culvert that was behind this factory became clogged with debris. The debris forced the water up and over the culvert. Floodwaters have now reached the railroad tracks. By now, chaos and destruction are happening over large parts of the city. People were either running towards the flood to help rescue other citizens or running away in terror. The sound of the destruction was something that haunted the children in the area for years to come. Just on the other side of the railroad culvert sat the home of Henry Allen. Henry's home was blasted off its foundation by the floodwaters and carried a block away. Henry Allen had drowned. His body was discovered near the remains of his home in the area of 14th and French. Henry, who was known to have trouble with his hearing, may not have even heard the flood approaching. Just down from Henry Allen's was the home of Anna Wiesbauer. Anna was the music teacher for the Erie schools. Her home sat just below 13th and French, before being obliterated by the flood. Her body was found a short distance from her home. The water has now made it to 11th Street, and the most critical area of the city. The power substation, located between 11th and 12th on French, begins to take on water. It's only a matter of a few seconds before the power to the entire city goes out. The destruction on 10th Street between French and Holland was nothing short of catastrophic. 24 people needed to be rescued from the homes along this area. Police and firemen were using anything they could to reach the stranded homeowners. Ropes were tied to trees, and makeshift bridges were even quickly fashioned out of boards or other debris. Just below 10th Street, the body of Cora Anderson was discovered after the flood. She had been swept from a house that collapsed on 17th Street. Eerily today, the baseball field home plate marks the exact spot she was found. 9th Street, between French and Holland, was practically wiped off the map. Erie police officer Larry Zimmer was attempting to rescue Mrs. Stazer from her home before it was destroyed. She slipped from his grasp and fell into the rushing water. The body of a young boy was also found in this area. Oddly, he was wearing swimming attire. The rush of water had now reached 8th Street. This was one of the worst hit areas of the flood, due to the fact it seems a large group of fatalities happened right here. It started with the discovery of Mrs. Stazer's body against the corner of the building. Next, the floodwaters ripped the home of John Higgins right from its foundation, and threw it across 8th Street, smashing it into the building. This caused the home to explode on impact and disintegrate. All 5 members from the Higgins family perished that night. The family refused to leave the house because their 1-year-old daughter was sick. Rescuers found the body of the sick little girl, clutching her deceased mother. Floodwaters have reached 7th Street and are heading through the center of the block between Holland and German streets. The daughter of George Inglet went missing soon after the flood. Police and firemen searched all night, but she couldn't be found. She was walking to her friend's house on East 7th Street. It appears she may have unknowingly walked directly into the path of the oncoming flood and was swept away. The floodwaters have now reached 6th Street, continuing to consume everything in its path. 5 more victims of the flood were discovered in the area of 6th and German. Most were from upstream and just ended up here. Looking at this area today, you would never know such a tragedy happened on this spot 105 years ago. The mayor of Erie, Mayor Stern as he was known, was attending a function at the Lawrence Hotel on West 10th Street when the floodwaters broke. He immediately began to make his way down to City Hall, to take charge of the situation. Upon arriving at City Hall, Mayor Stern found several families who had lost their homes had already gathered. He instructed him to be taken to an armory building just below 5th and State Street. Meanwhile, the floodwaters were making their way through the last remaining blocks of the city. The water, continuously spreading outward, had lost much of its force by now. This made the damage to homes much less severe than it was on the structures upstream. The floodwaters have now reached the bay, but the chaos hasn't stopped, at least not yet for the citizens of Erie. Mayor Stern had the grim task of ordering the steamboats at the public dock to search the bay for survivors and for the others that didn't make it. Throughout the night, the steamboats searched for survivors. Rescue efforts were hampered by the amount of debris in the water. Several boats eventually retrieved the remains of flood victims that had been washed out into the bay. The rain ended just before sunrise, and this gave the citizens of Erie the first real look at the destruction that had been done. The following morning, over 100 people were standing outside of the city mall. They were waiting to identify missing friends and family members. The loss of life and damage to the city was immense. The mayor called up the militia to help protect citizens from wandering into unsafe areas. The cleanup effort would be a slow and arduous process. Dynamite was used to bring down partially collapsed structures, until citizens complained that the sound reminded them of the approaching flood. The funeral for hero fireman John Donovan was held at St. Patrick's Church. There wasn't an empty seat to be had in the entire place. The damage to the city was estimated at more than $3 million. Not counting the continuing losses that the railroad was taking since the flood had severed their east-west rail line. But another round of bad news was about to hit the city. Fire Chief McMahon, who was saved by fellow firefighter John Donovan, had passed away at his home on 4th Street, 27 days after the flood. He had contracted typhoid pneumonia. Chief McMahon's funeral procession passed directly in front of the firehouse. To prevent this from happening again, Mill Creek was completely encased in a 2-mile tube that runs under the city. The large tube measures roughly 22 by 18 feet high, and is made entirely out of concrete. The tube is large enough to drive a truck through, and was designed to handle roughly 11,000 cubic feet of water per second. A short distance upstream, a drift catcher was fabricated to collect logs and other debris, sort of acting as a filter. Nobody knows if it will happen again. But one thing is for sure, Mother Nature will eventually test that theory. You've been watching the Mill Creek flood on Project Algerine.